The courtroom was packed. Every single seat was filled, and people were even standing along the walls, craning their necks to see what was happening. All eyes were glued to the 3 police officers standing nervously before the judge. Officer Miller, Officer Jones, and Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale and their uniforms suddenly feeling too tight. Judge Thompson slammed his gavel, the sound echoing through the silent room. "Officers Miller, Jones, and Davis," he boomed, his voice full of authority, "you are hereby sentenced to 10 days in jail for unlawful arrest and abuse of power." A gasp went through the crowd. 10 days in jail for arresting a man sleeping in his car? But that wasn't even the craziest part. The man they had arrested was Mayor Johnson, the mayor of their very own city. How could this have happened? How could 3 experienced police officers mistake the mayor for a common criminal? And why were they being punished so severely? To understand this shocking turn of events, we need to rewind to a few days earlier. It all started on a Tuesday night. Mayor Johnson had been working late, as usual. He was exhausted, his eyes heavy and his head pounding. He'd had a long city council meeting, followed by a late dinner with some important investors. By the time he finally left City Hall, it was well past midnight. The drive home was a blur. Mayor Johnson could barely keep his eyes open. He knew he should stop and rest, but he just wanted to get home to his warm bed. As he drove through a quiet residential neighborhood, his eyelids started to droop. He decided to pull over for just a few minutes, to close his eyes and clear his head. He found a quiet street, parked his car under a streetlight, and leaned back in his seat. He wasn't planning on sleeping, just resting his eyes for a bit. But the exhaustion was overwhelming, and soon he'd as fast asleep. He didn't hear the police car pull up beside him. He didn't see the flashing lights or the officers approaching his car with suspicion in their eyes. He was completely oblivious to the trouble that was about to unfold. Officer Miller rapped sharply on the window, startling Mayor Johnson awake. Disoriented and confused, he blinked at the bright light shining in his face. He rolled down the window, squinting at the officer. "Sir, do you know why we stopped you?" Officer Miller asked, his voice stern. "No, officer," Mayor Johnson mumbled, still half asleep. "Was I speeding?" Officer Miller exchanged a look with Officer Jones, who was standing on the other side of the car. "Sir, you were sleeping in your car in a residential neighborhood. We need you to step out of the vehicle." Mayor Johnson was now fully awake and starting to get annoyed. "I was just resting my eyes, officer. I'm on my way home." He reached for his wallet to get his driver's license. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," Officer Davis barked, his hand hovering near his holster. Mayor Johnson froze. Something wasn't right. These officers were treating him like a criminal. "Officers," he said, trying to stay calm, "I'm Mayor Johnson. I think there's been a misunderstanding." Officer Miller scoffed. "Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England." He grabbed Mayor Johnson's arm and pulled him roughly out of the car. "Hey, what are you doing?" Mayor Johnson protested, trying to pull away. "This is ridiculous." The officers ignored him. They handcuffed him and shoved him into the back of the police car. As the car pulled away, Mayor Johnson could see the smirks on the officers' faces. They thought this was a joke. They had no idea who they had just arrested, and they were about to find out. The ride to the police station was short and tense. Mayor Johnson sat in the back of the car, fuming. He couldn't believe the audacity of these officers. They had humiliated him, manhandled him, and treated him like a common criminal. He was the mayor, for crying out loud. Didn't they recognize him? He tried to reason with them again. "Look, officers, I understand you're just doing your job, but this is a huge mistake. I can show you my ID, call the chief of police, anything. Just let me go." Officer Miller, who was driving, just chuckled. Yeah, we've heard it all before. Save it for the judge, pal." Mayor Johnson clenched his fists, trying to control his anger. He knew getting into a shouting match with these officers wouldn't help his situation. He decided to stay quiet and wait for his chance to clear his name. At the police station, he was processed like any other suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his mugshot was snapped, and he was locked in a holding cell. The cell was small and grimy, with a hard bench and a dirty toilet in the corner. Mayor Johnson sat down on the bench, feeling a wave of nausea wash over him. He had never felt so degraded in his life. He spent what felt like an eternity in that cell, his mind racing with thoughts of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. He thought about his wife, his children, his constituents. What would they think when they heard about this? How could he explain this ridiculous situation? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, an officer came to his cell. "Johnson," he barked, "you're up." Mayor Johnson was led to a small interrogation room. Officer Miller and Officer Jones were already there, sitting at a table with smug looks on their faces. "Well, well, Mr. Mayor," Officer Miller sneered. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble." Mayor Johnson sat down across from them, his eyes blazing with anger. "This is outrageous. You have no right to detain me like this. I demand to speak to your superior officer immediately." Officer Jones laughed. "Oh, we're sure the captain will be thrilled to hear about this. Guess who we caught sleeping in his car tonight, Captain? The mayor. Ha! He'll be rolling on the floor." Mayor Johnson slammed his fist on the table. "This is not a joke. I am the mayor of this city. You will regret this." The officers exchanged amused glances. They clearly didn't believe him. They thought he was just another delusional suspect trying to talk his way out of trouble. "All right, Johnson," Officer Miller said, leaning forward. "Let's cut the act. We know you're not the mayor. Now, tell us what you were really doing sleeping in your car in that neighborhood." Mayor Johnson stared at them in disbelief. These officers were either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. He knew he had to handle this carefully. "Officer Miller," he said slowly, "I am not going to say this again. I am Mayor Johnson, and I am going to make sure you pay for this." Officer Miller burst out laughing. "Oh, we're terrified. What are you going to do, Mr. Mayor? Fire us?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're in no position to make threats, pal. You're in a whole lot of trouble." Just then, the door to the interrogation room swung open. A tall, imposing man in a police uniform strode in. He looked at the officers, his face grim. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Officer Miller jumped to his feet. "Captain, this guy—" He gestured towards Mayor Johnson. "He claims to be the mayor. We caught him sleeping in his car." The captain's eyes widened. He looked at Mayor Johnson, then back at the officers. A slow smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like you boys messed up big time." Recognition dawned on Officer Miller and Officer Jones. The blood drained from their faces as they realized the magnitude of their blunder. They had just arrested the mayor of their city, the man who held their careers in his hands. They stammered, trying to explain themselves, but the words caught in their throats. Captain Thompson, however, was not interested in their excuses. He fixed them with a withering glare. "You two idiots," he growled. "Have you any idea what you've done? You've arrested the mayor. Do you know how this looks for the department? Do you know the kind of trouble you're in?" The officers could only shake their heads, their faces pale with fear. They had gone from arrogant bullies to cowering subordinates in a matter of seconds. Captain Thompson turned to Mayor Johnson, his expression softening. "Mr. Mayor," he said, "I am so sorry for this. These officers have clearly overstepped their bounds. I assure you, they will be dealt with severely." Mayor Johnson, still seething with anger, nodded curtly. "See that they are, Captain. This is completely unacceptable." The captain then ordered the officers to unlock the handcuffs and escort the mayor out of the station. As Mayor Johnson walked out of the police station, a free man once again, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had been wronged, humiliated, but justice had prevailed. He knew this incident would have repercussions, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire police department. The next day, news of the mayor's arrest spread like wildfire. The local newspapers and TV stations had a field day with the story. The incident sparked outrage among the city's residents, who demanded accountability from the police department. Civil rights groups organized protests, calling for an end to racial profiling and police brutality. Mayor Johnson, despite the humiliation he had endured, saw an opportunity to bring about positive change. He held a press conference, condemning the actions of the officers and calling for a thorough review of the police department's policies and procedures. He promised to work with community leaders to improve relations between the police and the citizens they were sworn to protect. The 3 officers were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. They faced disciplinary action, including possible suspension or even termination. The incident served as a wake-up call for the police department, forcing them to confront the issue of racial bias within their ranks. But the story doesn't end there. The incident had unintended consequences, stirring up deep-seated resentment and distrust within the community. Some people saw the mayor's arrest as a symbol of the systemic racism that permeated society. Others questioned whether the officers would have been punished so severely if the victim had been an ordinary citizen. The city was divided, and the tension was palpable. Mayor Johnson, despite his best efforts, found himself caught in the middle of a storm. He knew that healing the wounds and restoring trust would be a long and difficult process. And then, just when things seemed to be calming down, a new crisis erupted. A series of burglaries targeting wealthy homes in the city had residents on edge. The police were baffled, unable to find any leads. The pressure was mounting on Mayor Johnson to restore order and ensure the safety of his citizens. But as the investigation into the burglaries deepened, a shocking discovery was made. A connection emerged between the burglaries and a group of disgruntled police officers who felt they had been unfairly punished for the mayor's arrest. The city was about to be plunged into a new wave of turmoil, a crisis that would test Mayor Johnson's leadership and threaten to tear the city apart. The string of burglaries had the city on edge. Every night, news reports showed images of ransacked homes, shattered windows, and terrified homeowners. The police, despite increased patrols and investigations, seemed to be hitting a wall. The perpetrators were meticulous, leaving no fingerprints or other evidence behind. Mayor Johnson, feeling the pressure mounting, called for a meeting with the chief of police and the lead detective on the case. "We need to find these criminals, and we need to find them now," he stressed, his voice firm. "The people of this city are losing faith in our ability to keep them safe." Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for cracking tough cases, assured the mayor they were doing everything they could. "We're following every lead, Mr. Mayor," he said, "but these guys are good. They're professionals." Days turned into weeks, and the burglaries continued. The city was gripped by fear, and rumors swirled about who might be behind the crimes. Some whispered about organized crime, others about a gang of sophisticated thieves from out of town. Then a break came in the case. A witness reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near one of the burglarized homes. The vehicle was traced back to a pawn shop, where the owner identified one of the men who had pawned some stolen jewelry. The man was a former police officer, recently dismissed from the force for misconduct. Detective Miller and his team quickly uncovered a network of former officers, all of whom had been disciplined or fired in the wake of the mayor's arrest. These officers, fueled by resentment and anger, had turned to crime, using their knowledge of police procedures to their advantage. The discovery sent shockwaves through the city. The mayor, already grappling with the fallout from his own arrest, now faced a new crisis. The very people entrusted with upholding the law were now breaking it. He knew he had to act swiftly and decisively. He authorized a series of raids, leading to the arrests of the rogue officers. The stolen goods were recovered, and the city breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the damage was done. The scandal further eroded public trust in the police department and deepened the divisions within the community. Mayor Johnson realized that restoring confidence and healing the wounds would require more than just arresting the culprits. He needed to address the root causes of the problem, the systemic issues that had allowed such a situation to arise in the first place. He announced a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the police department. He established a civilian review board to oversee police conduct and implemented mandatory training on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. He also launched community outreach programs to foster dialogue and build trust between the police and the citizens they served. The road ahead was long and challenging, but Mayor Johnson was determined to lead his city through the storm. He knew that the events of the past few months had changed the city forever, but he believed that they could emerge from this crisis stronger and more united than ever before. However, he was unaware that the biggest challenge was yet to come. A hidden player, lurking in the shadows, was about to make a move that would threaten everything he had worked for. The arrest of the rogue officers brought a sense of relief to the city, but it was a fragile peace. The underlying tensions remained, simmering beneath the surface. Mayor Johnson, despite his efforts to rebuild trust and promote unity, knew that the city was still vulnerable. He had underestimated the depth of resentment felt by some within the police department. While most officers were dedicated and honest, a small but vocal minority harbored a deep-seated animosity towards the mayor, blaming him for their colleagues' misfortunes. Among them was Sergeant Davis, a veteran officer with a history of disciplinary issues. Davis had been a close friend of Officer Miller, one of the officers jailed for arresting the mayor. He believed that the mayor had used his influence to unfairly punish Miller and the others, and he vowed to get revenge. Davis was cunning and manipulative. He began to sow seeds of discontent within the department, whispering about the mayor's supposed tyranny and his disregard for the sacrifices made by police officers. He painted a picture of a city spiraling out of control, a city where criminals roamed free while honest cops were persecuted. His words found fertile ground among those who felt aggrieved and marginalized. A small group of officers, disillusioned and angry, began to rally around Davis. They met in secret, plotting ways to undermine the mayor and disrupt his reform efforts. Their opportunity came during a city council meeting. Mayor Johnson was presenting his proposed budget, which included increased funding for community policing and social programs. The meeting was packed with residents, both supporters and opponents of the mayor's agenda. As the mayor spoke, a commotion erupted at the back of the hall. A group of protesters, led by Sergeant Davis, stormed into the meeting, shouting slogans and waving banners denouncing the mayor. The crowd erupted in chaos, with shouts and jeers echoing through the chamber. Mayor Johnson, caught off guard, tried to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the uproar. Davis, seizing the moment, jumped onto a table, his face contorted with rage. "This city is going to hell!" he bellowed. "This mayor is a traitor. He cares more about criminals than about the people he's supposed to protect." The crowd was whipped into a frenzy. Some in the audience began to chant Davis's name, while others hurled insults at the mayor. The meeting descended into a chaotic free-for-all, with people shoving and shouting at each other. Security guards struggled to contain the situation, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Fearing for the mayor's safety, they rushed him out of the hall and into a waiting car. As the car sped away, Mayor Johnson looked back at the chaotic scene. He felt a deep sense of betrayal and disappointment. He had tried to do the right thing, to bring about positive change, but it seemed like forces were conspiring against him. He knew that this was not just a simple protest. This was an orchestrated attack, a deliberate attempt to discredit him and sabotage his agenda. He had enemies within the very system he was trying to reform, enemies who were willing to use violence and intimidation to achieve their goals. He realized that the fight for his city, for its soul, had just begun. He would need all his strength, all his courage, to face the challenges ahead. He would not back down. He would not give in. He would fight for his city, for its people, until his very last breath.